on the psychosocial cost of racism to white university staff. My name is Denise Miller, and my co-researcher is Dr. Charmaine Brown. In recent years, the higher education landscape has seen a renewed focus on addressing institutional racism. This comes in response to pivotal events such as the tragic killing of George Floyd and the sobering statistics concerning the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on Black, Asian, and minority ethnic groups. It is true to say that educational leaders have made great efforts to create more equitable, diverse, and inclusive environments in higher education. However, despite these efforts, the experiences of Black, Asian, and minority ethnic staff within universities remains challenging. As we progress through this presentation, we will examine the significance of this study, which aims to shed light on the psychosocial cost of racism to white university staff members, a perspective that has been examined in the US, but not in the UK academic discourse. This is an original study. Our study's objective is not to overshadow, but to complement ongoing efforts to combat racism and promote equality for all. By studying the psychosocial cost on white staff, we hope to contribute to a more holistic dialogue on institutional racism. We believe that a balanced perspective is crucial for fostering empathy, understanding, and collaboration among all members of our academic community. In doing so, it's important to acknowledge the historical privilege that often comes with being part of the white majority. Throughout history, white individuals have benefited from social structures that have favored their racial identity. Recognizing this privilege is an important step towards a more inclusive future. It allows us to reflect on the unearned advantages that have contributed to disparities within our academic institutions. Furthermore, white university staff members have had a pivotal role to play in addressing these disparities. Given their historical privilege and potential influence, they are uniquely positioned to be allies in the fight against racism. In their influential positions, white colleagues can advocate for change, challenge systemic biases, and actively contribute to creating more equitable universities in a way that Black, Asian, and minority ethnic people cannot. Let's examine the concept of psychosocial costs of racism for white individuals, as introduced by Cavell in 1996. This concept highlights the emotional and economic toll that racism can have on white people. The emotional turmoil is a key aspect. According to Cavell, white individuals who recognize their privilege and the systemic nature of racism might feel guilt and shame for benefiting from unequal systems. This internal conflict could lead to feelings of isolation and a reduction in social interactions. Economically, some white individuals may find themselves bound to maintain their status in hierarchical systems, perpetuating historical inequalities. This drive for social, economic mobility may result in overlooking the welfare of marginalised communities. There is plenty of research examining the psychosocial cost of racism to white people in the US. Goodman's study with white students revealed reduced empathy, guilt, and internalized oppression. Spannerman et al. Found that white university freshmen demonstrated changing behaviors over time, reflecting empathetic guilt or obliviousness. Exum's work explored perceived consequences and uncovered feelings of shame and embarrassment in change of appearance scenarios. Across these studies, common themes emerge: guilt, shame, and cognitive dissonance, often accompanied by social, emotional, and mental health impacts on white people's well-being. These findings resonate with Cavell's notions of the psychosocial cost of racism to white people. And it's important to consider these insights in our pursuit for a more equitable academic environment in higher education.
As we explore the psychosocial costs of racism within university staff, it's important to recognise a significant gap in existing research. As mentioned previously, historically, studies have predominantly focused on understanding the impact of racism on Black, Asian, and minority ethnic individuals. However, there's a distinct lack of attention when it comes to the experiences of white university staff in relation to the psychosocial costs of racism. This uncharted territory leaves us with an incomplete understanding of how racism affects everyone. Surely, white university staff, while often beneficiaries of racial privilege, face their own set of emotional and psychological challenges stemming from the systemic nature of racism. Addressing this question and a gap in the research is important if we are to develop a comprehensive understanding of the impact of racism within academia. In this study, we aim to answer the following questions. Why did you want to become involved with this research? How do you define racism? How does racism affect you? And how can racism be addressed in your university? Our research project was divided into two phases. In phase 1, we started with the necessary ethical clearance obtained from the University Research Ethics Committee. This clearance ensured that our research adhered to the highest ethical standards, safeguarding the rights and welfare of all participants. Following the ethical clearance, we initiated the survey phase by sending invitations to staff members in a post-92 higher education institution. The survey itself was administered online through Qualtrics, a platform that allowed us to efficiently collect data and maintain participant anonymity. Moving on to phase 2, we conducted semi-structured interviews to examine the perceptions of racism amongst higher education staff members. These interviews were conducted via Microsoft Teams, allowing for remote participation and lasting up to 60 minutes each. Our interviews were guided by a carefully developed interview guide featuring open-ended questions designed to explore participants' perceptions of racism within their university. To ensure the accuracy of our data collection, we had a team of 2 researchers present during each interview. One served as the interviewer and the other remained off camera, ensuring that all aspects of the interview process ran smoothly. In total, there were 12 participants who self-identified as white. They came from diverse faculties and campuses. There were 7 males and 5 females, and the sample distribution spanned various employment levels and lengths of service. Each participant was interviewed once. At the end of each interview, participants were invited to share anything they felt might be helpful to the study. They were also informed that their involvement in the study would remain anonymous in any subsequent disseminations, and they were made aware of relevant support services they could access should they so wish. Each transcript referred to a participant using an individualized code chosen by researchers to maintain anonymity. After checking the transcripts for accuracy, the audio recordings were saved in Microsoft Teams files, and thereafter they were deleted from the researchers' personal devices. The analysis of our data followed Braun and Clark's reflexive thematic analysis framework, which involves a systematic approach ensuring trustworthiness and validity. We began by immersing ourselves in the data, generating preliminary codes based on interesting features and creating an early report. The identification of themes followed as we regrouped data into potential patterns. During this process, themes were reviewed, refined, and named, guided by ongoing analysis and aligned with existing literature. Our commitment to transparency allowed us to maintain a clear process that can be replicated, while reflexivity ensured that our perspectives and biases were acknowledged throughout. In order to validate our findings, we engaged with critical friends and conducted member check-in, further enhancing the credibility of our analysis. This rigorous approach helped to ensure that our results are robust, reliable, and reflective of the data we collected.
Moving forward in our presentation, let's look at the 4 main themes that emerged from our data analysis. It's important to note that these findings are based on the perspectives of white university staff members, shedding light on their experiences and insights regarding institutional racism within higher education institutions. Theme 1 examines the motivations behind white university staff members' involvement in our study. It highlights their genuine interest in expanding knowledge and contributing even without expertise. One participant said,
"There's currently a lot of interest in the realities of racism and prejudice in the UK, and it's something that I have been conscious of in my own academic career. Not as a victim of it, but it's something that I have seen affecting other people and colleagues. So I'm just interested in taking part in providing data."
their awareness of racism's impact on Black, Asian, and minority ethnic colleagues and the academic disparities they witness drive our participants' commitment to get involved in this study. Furthermore, their interest in understanding the BAME awarding gap shows a desire to address institutional racism's role in academic outcomes. These participants seek open conversations about their experiences and hidden issues, while engaging with people from diverse backgrounds enriches their empathy and perspectives.
It's not kind of discussed in an open way. It's, very cloak and dagger. But I'm very much interested in this conversation and how this conversation can be widened out.
Our participants' call for inclusivity and solidarity demonstrates a recognition of shared struggles for equality, irrespective of their racial background. They acknowledge their privilege and its potential for advocacy. Ultimately, white staff members' social and moral obligation drives their participation as they strive for real change and a more just academic landscape. In Theme 2, the findings represent white university staff members' definitions of racism within their academic context. Their understanding of racism is not limited to individual actions, but expands to encompass hierarchical, systemic, and institutional biases that perpetuate racial inequalities.
It's very hierarchical, it's very structured, there's a way of doing things. Even this, modern university, post 92 university, it feels like it's taken on the trappings.
Participants emphasize the ineffective impact of legislation on the underrepresentation of Black, Asian, and minority ethnic individuals in leadership roles, indicating the persistence of racial disparities and the maintenance of the status quo. This echoes Macpherson's definition of institutional racism, which these white university staff members concur with. The participants' definitions also highlight the hierarchical and structured nature of the institutions, creating power dynamics that can exploit vulnerabilities, particularly for historically discriminated racial groups. According to our participants, this exploitation contributes to a cycle of disadvantage, hindering career progression and Black, Asian, and minority ethnic people's potential to thrive.
If people think that they can exploit vulnerabilities, if you are from a racial group that is historically discriminated, that does create certain disadvantages, obviously, and people exploit them further. People who think like this will exploit them further.
In summary, white university staff members perceive racism as such a twisted way. It's rooted in hierarchical structures and systemic biases that thwart equality, diversity, and inclusive attempts within their academic environments. In Theme 3, we examined the psychosocial cost of racism on university staff members. Despite not being the primary targets of racism, white staff members reported experiencing a range of emotional responses when witnessing discriminatory incidents affecting their Black, Asian, and minority ethnic colleagues. This included feelings of anger, guilt, and moral discomfort.
I suppose indirectly, in the sense that I've witnessed colleagues experiencing indirect racism, and so I suppose it does affect me to that extent. Quite uncomfortable. I felt terrible in the moment. I felt absolutely terrible.
The concept of vicarious responsibility emerged where white staff members felt guilt and shame for potentially contributing to the suffering of their Black, Asian, and minority ethnic colleagues. These negative emotions had psychophysical effects, indicating the emotional toil of racism, even when they are not directly targeted. Racial anxiety was also evident, causing some staff members to withdraw from discussions about race due to fear of saying something insensitive. This withdrawal may stem from the desire to protect themselves from negative consequences.
Extremely traumatizing. The context is just not healthy. It's a very distressing topic. I just felt this wave, like a wave of embarrassment and kind of shame and awkwardness. It's embarrassing, it's kind of shameful, just kind of like the horrible knots in my stomach, thinking, oh my God, that's just embarrassing.
In our exploration of white university staff's responses to witnessing racism, we encountered diverse coping strategies and emotional responses. The quotes on this slide highlight how white university staff members navigate the challenging terrain of confronting racial issues. Some staff members employ avoidance and denial as mechanisms to cope. They push thoughts about racial disparities out of their awareness, possibly due to the difficulty of addressing these complex topics. Others adopt a self-preservation strategy, creating an emotional armor to protect themselves from the discomfort that discussions of racism can evoke. These barriers may help to shield white university staff members from the emotional impact, but may also delay open dialogue. Value-based distancing emerges as another coping strategy. Some staff members opt not to associate with individuals or groups that perpetuate discriminatory values.
I don't want to be part of their gang because I don't like what they don't do. I don't want to negotiate on my value set, particularly around race. I guess it's indirectly affected me in that sense that I'm not prepared to join a tactic club.
These findings reflect white university staff members' commitment to upholding their own values and distancing themselves from toxic environments. The responses provide insight to the many ways in which they manage the emotional challenges associated with confronting institutional racism.
In Theme 4, white university staff members voiced their concerns about the potential consequences of existing practices that are supposed to bring about change. They raised questions about the effectiveness of superficial efforts and pointed out the crucial role of senior leaders in taking personal responsibility to address systemic racism. Some participants feared that if the university fails to acknowledge and address these issues adequately, a crisis point may be inevitable. This concern was echoed by the anticipation of explosive reactions and even rioting if people are pushed to their limits.
You might have an explosion. When you kind of push people to a limit, then you know people explode, and that's no good.
It's important to acknowledge that these views were not uniform and can vary amongst individuals. Despite these challenging perspectives, some participants still maintained a sense of optimism and hope for the future, recognizing the need to continue despite the obstacles.
I have to maintain some degree of optimism, otherwise, how can you carry on?
On the other hand, there were strong expressions of frustration and a belief that more radical approaches are needed. Metaphorically, comparing the situation to the need to blow up and rebuild the institution. White university staff members emphasised the need for more profound and systemic change.
I do feel like Guy Fawkes. I think the only way to fix the faculty is to blow it up. Blow it up, smash it.
This theme highlights the tensions between hoping for positive change while acknowledging the urgency of addressing fundamental issues. It's the reflection of the complex emotions and perspectives that white university staff hold in the face of institutional racism. Now, let's move on to summarising the findings of our study. Our findings shed light on how white staff members perceive institutional racism, aligning their views with the definitions outlined by the Macpherson Inquiry. White university staff recognise racism as deeply embedded within the structures and practices of their institution. Motivated by a desire for change and understanding, white staff members bring a distinctive perspective to the field, acknowledging their role as beneficiaries of systemic inequalities. However, our research highlights that acknowledging racism's systemic nature can lead to feelings of guilt, shame, and anger amongst white staff. The cognitive dissonance arising from recognizing their racial privileges adds another layer to their emotional response. Furthermore, confronting racial disparities and engaging in activism can impact white university staff members' mental health, leading to stress, exhaustion, and frustration. Our study reinforces the importance of a holistic approach to addressing racism in higher education. It calls for understanding the experiences of both dominant and marginalised groups to effectively combat institutional racism. Lastly, we can draw parallels between our research and global movements for change, emphasising the urgency of transformation to prevent potential crises.
As with any study, there are certain limitations that we need to acknowledge. The first limitation pertains to the sample size and the way ethnicity categories were handled. Due to the small sample, we chose to collapse ethnicity categories to protect our participants' identities. However, this approach limits our ability to capture the distinct experiences of each individual participant. It's important to recognize that being white does not necessarily mean participants lack diverse cultural backgrounds. As well, we did not fully consider how participants' socio-economic status, gender identity, and other intersecting identities might influence their experiences of racism. For future research endeavours, it would be valuable to examine the interplay between different forms of discrimination and how they interact to shape individuals' experiences. This may provide a more comprehensive understanding of how diverse identities influence and shape the impact of institutional racism. Now let's move on to discuss actionable steps drawn from our study. In terms of actionable steps within higher education institutions, our participants recommend the adoption and implementation of inclusive policies and practices. These should directly address institutional racism and promote diversity at all levels of the institution. Moreover, they said it's important to encourage white staff members to become allies. This might be achieved through awareness campaigns, workshops, and discussions that help people to better understand systemic racism and how they can actively support anti-racist efforts. Considering the psychosocial impact of racism, higher education institutions should provide resources and support for the mental health and well-being of its staff members. Establishing confidential external support networks can offer a safe space for individuals to cope with the emotions related to racism. Lastly, intersectional training should be provided to staff members. This training should address the interconnectedness of different forms of discrimination and provide tools to recognise and address biases and discrimination. By taking these recommendations into account, our participants feel we can work towards creating a more inclusive and equitable environment in higher education institutions. Thank you for your attention. Here is a list of indicative references for your information.